I'll give you okay, good. Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Very good. I don't think you can. That'd be a lead 8 game. I'm enjoying my I wouldn't be in that. All right, good evening, everybody. Good to see you. Hope everybody's doing well in the middle of the week. If you have your Bibles, you want to open them to Mark chapter 11. That's what we'll be studying this evening. We'll try to wrap up with last couple stories here in Mark 11 before you move on, and try to look at the first part of chapter 12 as well. I asked Hunter to lead us in a prayer. So after that, we'll get going.
Our God and Father in heaven, we thank you for this day and all that you've given us in it. We thank you for allowing us to come together to study another portion of your word, and we pray that all of those who are teaching this hour will have prepared good lessons that are fruitful for us, and that we as listeners and participants can take something from it and apply it to our everyday walks in life to help be better servants of yours in the future than we have been in the past. We ask you to be with those of this number who are sick. Guide those who are caring for them. They'll provide the remedies necessary for them to recover fully. We ask you would go with us throughout this evening, throughout the rest of our lives. Help us always look to you for guidance and strength. And we pray that you will forgive us when we fail to live up to the standards that you've set for us. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thank you, Hunter. Hunter mentioned something in his prayer that I pray quite often, and most of us do, that we would look at God's Word and then find ways to apply it in our life. And that's one of my favorite parts about studying the Gospels. When we look at Jesus, there's so much good advice from Jesus that we can use very practically in our everyday lives. And I think a good challenge for us is find something this week, a decision that we can make or an action that we can take that's been informed by what we've learned from Christ. And we'll see some very practical things tonight in the lesson that we look at. So I think about that quite often, especially when reading the words of Jesus specifically. What we opened class with on Sunday was talking about how it really feels like a big shift now that we're getting into chapter 11, because we are now into this final week of the life of Christ. So these last few chapters in Mark, I think, are very important. They just feel different, knowing that Jesus has come back to Jerusalem and he's here for the final week. And so we kind of broke down the timeline a little bit, understanding a lot of what's going on in our class tonight has to do with these first couple days, these Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, these first few days of the week. So we started introducing that, and then we talked a little bit how I think it's important when we do study these final few chapters to think about it in terms of what did Jesus find important in his last week. So he knows it's the last week of his life, and so everything he's doing has a purpose behind it. And of course, his entire ministry did, but it just seems more important. This is his last week. He's going to take care of a few things that he wants to wrap up before his time on earth is done. And so we talked about teaching, lots of lessons, and there'll be a lot of teaching from him tonight. He takes time for prayer. He takes time to rebuke. I'm thinking specifically of interactions with the Pharisees as well as the Sadducees, if we have time to get that into chapter 12 tonight. There's prophecy. There's all these things that Jesus finds important during the final week of his life. We talked Sunday about the triumphal entry, a little bit about the significance of the palm branches and laying down the cloak, and then we got into the cleansing of the temple. So what we're going to open with tonight is this story about cursing the fig tree. So we read the first little bit of it because the way that Mark does this, I think Matthew kind of shoves it all into one story, but the way Mark does this is approaches it two different times. So we read 12, 13, and 14, and I'll reread that here in a second. But then we'll actually get to the lesson he teaches about it. So we'll notice that the disciples, it says, as they pass by in the morning in verse 20, they notice it, and then they remember what happened previously, and then he teaches them a lesson about it. So that's what we'll open with. So look at verse 12 of Mark 11. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And the disciples heard it. I don't know if any of you were like me, but whenever I was younger and I read this, I just thought it was so random. What was the point of that? Why is that in here? It just seems extremely random. Maybe a little less random in Matthew where it's kind of all put together, but in Mark it's just this one snippet and then it moves on to something else. Like, what was the reason behind that? But if I could have a volunteer, somebody please read verses 20 through 25 now that he's going to teach the lesson behind it, and then we'll talk a little bit about this story.
As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered." And Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that if you have received it, it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses." Lots of reading.
Yes, very good, very good. So I want to hear from some of you who've studied this in the past. What do you remember about this story? Why is it that Jesus curses this fig tree? Does it have a point behind it, or is it like I thought when I was young, it's just completely random? What was the point behind the story?
It had not produced what it was put there for. And I guess we could apply to us, the Christians, if we don't produce, and we should, then Lord, penalize us in judgment.
Right. Many stories, especially in the New Testament, about the need for Christians to bear fruit, kind of comparing us to a tree that needs to bear fruit. And if we're not bearing fruit, consequences behind that. So perhaps there's part of that to it. Yes,
with, fruit trees, obviously it goes through a long process. So the fruit does not come at the same time as the leaves. So the thing to think about with this tree is like there's not even a sign of there being the possibility of fruit on it apparently, where there's no blossoms, there's no immature fruit. Because Jesus could have easily done something to speed up that process and make it be more fruitful, but apparently this tree was completely useless and not even an inkling of bearing fruit.
But
Yeah.
it says it's not the season, so that doesn't, I don't get that, to be honest. It's not the season for there to be
But it
fruit.
would have had at least like a bud or something on it, because even when it's, before it leaves, like fruit trees or bushes, when they're even in this winter stage, you can tell on the ends of the tips of the stick that there's going to be something growing there. Even when it's a naked stick, you can see the possibility of growth. So even if it's just in leaf and not bearing fruit yet, there would be something to show that it will be fruitful.
That's what he says in verse 13, Rebecca's point, right? Perhaps he would find something on it. But yes, it's not in season, but there should have been something on it. So it may look like a good tree from a distance, but when he went to go look, there wasn't nothing on it that should have been on it. And so then he curses the tree because you're not even what you're supposed to be doing. So the point for us is simple, right? It may not be time that we're able to produce at that point, but there needs to be something. So hey, I'm going to get to this point in Christ, I'm going to get to this point in Christ. If you don't have a little bit of anything, then you can't come up to something out of osmosis. I think his point is, yes, there's a journey, but if you don't see anything that shows fruit of the fruit, then we're not even on track.
Right, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I think,
Thank you.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think when you get to the explanation though, not the main point, but one of the points is they were surprised that like, hey, you cursed that thing and look, it withered. Like, they were still in shock that what he said happened, and he's trying to say, I'm telling you, God's gonna do what he says he's gonna do. If I say this is gonna wither, it's gonna wither. If I say I'm gonna rise, I'm gonna rise. Like, he's still trying to get that point across.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to that point, God is God, and Jesus is all-knowing. They know everything there is to know. They know what's going to come to pass. But I think at that point, he's hungry. He goes to the tree thinking maybe there's something on it, and so there's nothing on it, so he curses the tree, fully expecting the tree's going to die because he said it's cursed now. And a few days later, when they walk by, and they're like, oh, it's shriveled up. Like, of course it is.
Right.
Like, I said it was going to. And if you have that same faith, you can do that as well.
Right.
There was never a question in his mind that the tree was going to do what it did.
Exactly.
And he's trying to impart that same confidence and power, for lack of a better term, to those who are with him.
Yeah, good point.
It's an extended object lesson that he may or may not have intended to do.
When we went over to, I don't know, east or whatever it is, when we went over there, our guide was a professor from University of Jerusalem. And he had traveled before with our head, I think his name, Don Bassett. And he was talking about this pure virgin oil and how that women buy that and disregard the other, although he said they're really the same oil. He said, you know how long it takes to produce good oil from a big tree? And for what? Forget it.
I was waiting. I knew he was going to tie it in some way, and I was waiting.
That's right.
It's interesting when you study and you research what commentators think about this story from Jesus. There's a lot of conflicting ideas. I don't know if anyone's heard this before, but there are quite a bit of ideas out there that this was a symbol for Israel, and Jesus is symbolically pronouncing a curse against Israel. They had not been doing what they were supposed to be doing, like the fig tree, and he curses them, symbolizing the end of Judaism. There are, however, many commentators looking at that thinking not lots of evidence for that. And that's why I put this kind of last bullet point, and it has to do with what Hunter was talking about. I think one thing that is perfectly obvious for us is that it was a great object lesson in faith. And that's where the explanation goes. So they see it, and like Hunter was saying, they're almost like surprised to see it. And the question is, why are you surprised? Jesus said it was going to happen, so of course it's going to happen. And then starting in verse 23, he uses that to then teach faith, which was a phenomenal lesson and one that the disciples needed about what you need in faith. One question I had on this, when it came to prayer, what does Jesus say? What are the qualifiers in order to get answered prayer? He mentions two things. What do you have to have in order to have your prayers answered according to this story?
Faith.
Okay, faith, belief, as he mentions. And what is the other thing that he mentions towards the end of the story? Forgiveness. So look at verse 25. Whenever you stand praying, forgive. If you have anything against anyone, so that your Father, who's also in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses. So another lesson he teaches there. You have to come in faith. You have to have belief. And then if you're going to go to God in prayer, forgive first. If you want forgiveness, make sure you are willing to forgive as well.
So in other words, your heart has to look a certain way. You have to have a forgiving heart.
Correct.
In order to.
Yes, that's a great point. If you want forgiveness, be willing to forgive others as well.
And you mentioned, I think in the last slide, just in the last week of Jesus' life, like how his ministry kind of changes. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is obviously integral to what his disciples will need when he's not there with them.
Yes.
And even going beyond his death and resurrection, when he ascends, they're going to be the ones doing the miracles, and they're going to be the ones who need to prove, salvation that they're trying to give to others. And they're going to need these miracles and the faith in order to work these miracles to continue their whole work. Right.
Yeah, I'm sure he felt in this last week there was so much he needed to teach his disciples before he got there. That's a good point. Any final thoughts on the fig tree before we move on to Jesus' authority being challenged?
Yeah, I think it's worth being said again that you can pray to God, and because you have not forgiven someone, truly forgiving, meaning not to hold something against them, God is sitting there looking at you saying, are you crazy? Do you know that I'm holy? And so we can go beg and plead and Lord, please, and he's sitting there saying, and you want me to do the littlest thing I told you. I think that's important because as Christians, sometimes we think, I forgave Josh, even though I'm going to treat him bad because I really don't like him. Right?
Right.
The answer is you're still in sin. Don't get that figured out.
Right. Yeah, great point. Okay, let's look at this next story, 27 through the end of chapter 11 here. Jesus' authority challenge. One theme we see throughout the Gospels, whether it's the scribes and Pharisees or it's the Sadducees, constantly trying to lay these traps. And so here they are attempting to lay another trap, and then they'll do this again when we get to chapter 12. But somebody read 27 through 33 for us.
And they came again to Jerusalem. As he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. And they said to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you the authority to do them? Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question. Answer me. And I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. And they discussed it with one another, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why then do you not believe him? But shall we say from man? They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things.
Okay. So when they first come to him, these chief priests, scribes, and elders, when they say, by what authority are you doing these things? What things? What are they referring to?
All of the miracles that he had performed.
Okay. And
He just cleaned out the temple.
right. So this is on the heels of him doing something pretty dramatic in verses 15 through 19, coming in, cleansing out the temple, and they obviously would have seen this, and this would have caused quite the scene. It says they feared and the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And so they're asking him, why do you think you can do this? By what authority do you do these things? And he could have given them an answer. He had a good answer. He could have given them an answer. But someone described this situation that he sets up. He will answer them if what? Yeah, he's got a question for them first. And this question that he asks has to do with the baptism of John. Someone explain, why does this set up such a dilemma for them? Why are they unable to answer?
Because they're still dealing with the law and prophets thing. Here comes the baptism of John. I'll read Luke 16, starting at verse 16, but I think that's the aha. When Jesus is talking to them, he says, the law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is pressing into it, and it is easier for earth to pass away than for one tittle of the law to fail, right? So, think about what he said, because a lot of people get that twisted up. It's going to be easier for earth to pass away than one tittle of the law to fail. But he's already told you the law and prophets were till John, right? And then the kingdom. And then he goes off this random thing, because it seems random, when he then says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her, which is divorced from her husband, commits adultery. Well, that's completely different than what the law said in the first place. So now they would be messed up. And so you see a transition of Jesus trying to get them to understand, what was the purpose of the law and the prophets? And you can't answer that, because if you answer that, you're about to get tripped up. So they say, and maybe they didn't know, I don't know.
Right. I feel like they understood what they wanted to say, but they couldn't say it. Why couldn't they say it? They couldn't say, yes, the baptism of John is from heaven. Why couldn't they say that? Why couldn't they agree with that?
They didn't follow along.
They didn't follow it. They didn't do it. They showed that they didn't believe it. There were issues with them accepting the baptism of John. Yet they can't say no. Why is it that they can't say no? It did not come from heaven. They're afraid of the people. There's quite a following here that would have agreed with it, that is following Jesus, and they feared these people. There's quite a crowd now who is following and going along with Jesus, so they can't answer either way. And so they just say, well, we don't know. And then I like how Jesus says, well, I'm not answering you either. If you're not going to be honest with me, then I'm not going to give you an answer. A lot of good lessons here. Put up there, verse 33, he's not interested in playing this game if they can't just be honest with him.
Hey, Jacob, I think Harkrider makes a good point in his book. He says when they asked him by what authority are you doing these things, they were referring to, hey, what school did you get accredited from to be a rabbi, to be a teacher? And, Jesus is saying, look, you're talking about the authority of men. I'm talking about the authority of God, and that's what matters.
Yeah.
So
that's a great point.
Yeah.
Really thought there's a practical lesson here for us, and that's be careful of defending a position that you can't provide a simple answer to. I was preparing for this lesson, and I was also listening a lot to do with these cabinet appointment hearings that have been going on. It's just kind of funny sometimes listening to those, and you get someone kind of cross-examining and asking these tough questions, and they'll just ask a very simple yes or no question, and the person on the stand knows they can't say yes or no, because they're defending something that's much more complicated, and they don't really feel like giving an answer to. You can't just give a simple answer now. I think be careful in life of defending things and believing in things that you are uncomfortable explaining to people. And they were uncomfortable with either answer, yes or no. They had a hard time accepting either one. I just think that's kind of a practical lesson for us. Just be aware of what we believe and be able to defend it and be comfortable defending it. If you're believing something that you can't feel comfortable talking about or defending it, these people could, then there could be something wrong with that. Any other lessons from the authority of Jesus being challenged here that you'd like to bring out?
I wonder why those who question him, he says, neither will I answer you. But you got to think that they know the answer already. Like, this struggle that they're having, like, they're scared of the people, they're clearly attached to their positions of power, and you see that even in Acts. Like, they know in their hearts that there's something that they don't have,
Right.
and they're still attached to, I guess, their physical authority they believe they have. And when Jesus mentions this contrast between God's authority and man's authority, it's almost this sort of like binary. Like you can only have one or the other. So you want to make sure that your authority comes from God.
Right.
And in that way, like, they know that if he's claiming of God, they know the answer.
You're
You know
right.
they know the answer. He's just not going to say it because they're so
Yeah.
stubborn. They're not going to.
I also feel there's times where they seem really eager to just jump on him with this blasphemy charge, and he just won't give it to him, just straight up, and that infuriates them at times.
We see in 18, they're the same chief priests and scribes that heard what he was saying were seeking a way to destroy him.
Right.
Feared him.
They just want him to come out and say that
Yeah.
I'm the Son of God, and that's just not how he
Yeah,
went
they wanted
about his
to
ministry.
open that case.
Right. Yeah, they were very eager to nail him with that blasphemy charge for sure.
And I think it may not be in this scenario, but in most of his teaching, he's wanting people to arrive at their conclusions. He's not
Exactly.
just giving it to them. I mean, you think of that even in teaching. Like, you don't just always want to give people answers. You
Right.
want them to think through themselves and come to it because it means more when you come to the conclusion.
Right.
More about how to think through what to think.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot recently. Jesus, throughout his entire ministry, he's rarely just coming out as being extremely blunt. He wants people to arrive at things on their own, which is what most of these parables are. They're ways to get you thinking about a heavenly principle without just coming out and directly saying it. He does that often in his ministry.
And to do it, it shows that you've learned it.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, you're not spoon feeding answers. People are arriving to it based on what you present. Yes, sir.
This is one verses where we're teaching the authority class, and we go to that verse.
Yeah.
Go to Matthew first, or there's a little bit more in depth.
Right.
But you gotta have authority for everything you do. Or times you're gonna ask you, well, you know, and you just don't have a good answer if you got this answer.
Exactly. That's a great point. All right, let's get into chapter 12. We'll try to get to these first two stories at least. So we have a parable. Not many parables left in the ministry of Jesus, but this is the parable of the tenants. So what I want you to be thinking about as we read through this, and it's verses 1 through 12, it seems that Jesus has a point behind this parable where the different characters that show up in this parable are somebody that we want to kind of break down after we read it. So be thinking about who are these different characters of this parable as we go along. So could I have a reader, please? Take 1 through 12 for us, and let's look at the parable of the tenants.
Then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it, dug a place for the wine vat, and built a tower. And he leased it to vine dressers and went into a far country. Now at vintage time, he sent a servant to the vine dressers that he might receive some of the fruit of the vineyard from the vine dressers. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent them another servant, and at him they threw stones, wounded him in the head, and sent him away shamefully treated. And again he sent another, and him they killed, and many others, beating some and killing some. Therefore, still having one son, his beloved, he also sent him to them last, saying, They will respect my son. But those vine dressers said among themselves, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they took him and killed him, and cast him out of the vineyard. Therefore, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine dressers and give the vineyard to others. Have you not even read this scripture? The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they sought to lay hands on him, but feared the multitude, for they knew he had spoken the parable against them. So they left him and went away.
Yeah, I really like verse 12. They're sitting there listening to that, thinking, wait a minute, talking about me. So let's go through this parable. And who are some of the characters? We can start with the most obvious and kind of work our way down, but somebody give me a character from this parable and who it represents. There should be a really obvious one there.
Son is Jesus.
There we go. If we couldn't arrive at that one, we're in trouble. Obviously the son that is killed, this is Jesus. So we've got that one out of the way. Who are some of these other characters in here? I mean, we're obviously told a hint in verse 12. Prophets. Okay, I believe prophets are in here. Who do we think the prophets are in this parable?
John the Baptist.
Well, the characters in the parable, not the real person. There we go, the servants. Okay, so these servants that are mistreated, there's a few here. Verse 1 and verse 2, verse 4, another servant. Verse 5, another servant. So what happens with each servant? What do we notice as we go along with each servant? Okay, so the severity of how they're treated gets worse and worse, escalating with them ultimately killing in the end. Good. So then who would the tenants be? Or some of y'all would say vine dressers. Okay. And the hint is verse 12 when they realize, Jesus is telling the story against me. So we have the tenants being the Jewish leadership at the time. And so is the last one is who is the one planting the vineyard? All right, God. So we got all of our characters now set in place. And so the point here, I really like how he ends this story with a quotation. What does this, or where does this quote come from in verse 10 about the stone that the builders rejected? Where does that come from?
Psalm 118:22.
Yeah, that's Psalm 118:22. So I think this is a phenomenal parable, and he's telling it against this Jewish leadership. There's this vineyard that is set up, that God sets up, and he's putting the Jews in charge. And just as we think about the stories of the Old Testament, prophets are sent. They're often mistreated. We have multiple passages talking about prophets being mistreated. I should have prepared this ahead of time, but what's the New Testament, the sermon about mistreating and killing the prophets? Is it Stephen? Yeah. There's multiple places where we can read about that. These are these servants being mistreated. Those are the prophets, and then ultimately killing the son. And then I love this quotation from Psalm: "The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone." The Jews of this time, they've thrown out the cornerstone. They've thrown out Jesus. They've rejected him as a stone, seeking to continue building a wall without the most important stone, and that being Christ. But as Jesus references here from Psalm, he ends up becoming the most important and the chief cornerstone. So a very interesting parable here. Any thoughts that stuck out to you guys from this story?
Yeah, I think it's amazing that he just told them, hey, you guys didn't listen to the prophet. Continue to get worse. You guys kill the son, and the son happens to end up becoming the chief cornerstone. You think about Luke 15 with the rich Lazarus and the rich man.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, hey, send Lazarus back to my brothers so they receive him. And he says, your brothers have Moses and the prophets. All along, God had his word that if people were of sincere heart, it would have led them to truth, right? And that's what he's really saying. You guys are going to become so bad against wanting to accept truth because of your pride or because you want to empower, whatever it is. You're going to end up killing the son who's going to end up being the chief cornerstone. Can you imagine what people thought after that day?
Oh, yeah.
Man,
Yeah.
all the stuff would ring in their ear.
Right. And that's why in verse 12 they're seeking to arrest him now. And then the ultimate conclusion of this parable is verse 9. God is going to destroy these tenants. The one who planted the vineyard is going to come back and destroy these tenants for what they've done. The way that these Jewish leaders have been acting and the way that they've had power, it's all coming to an end very soon. So spiritually it's coming to an end because of a new covenant being set up, but physically this is all coming to an end, in just a few decades as Rome ends up destroying Jerusalem and then the temple is no more. Any final thoughts? Yes.
I think verse, 7 also illustrates how, like, they misunderstood even what the expectation was of you know, Jesus coming. Here, they're like, well, let's kill him and the inheritance will be ours. They don't understand, like, what's really gonna happen,
Right.
the consequence of this. And they also didn't understand Jesus' mission and what the kingdom was and all of that. So I think Jesus incorporates that a little bit here as well.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right.
I think verse 9 also kind of shows that it's a little bit of foreshadowing into, you know, after the resurrection where the gospel goes to Gentiles.
Yeah, giving the vineyard to others.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. All right. 10 minutes left. I think we can get into this paying taxes to Caesar, and then possibly this last story that I want to look at with the Sadducees and the resurrection. But let's talk a little bit about this story, paying taxes to Caesar. Could somebody read 13 through 17? And here we've got yet another story of trying to trap Jesus. Let's see how he handles this. Could somebody read 13 through 17, please?
Then they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words. When they had come, they had said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one. For you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay? But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, Why do you test me? Bring me a denarius that I may see it. Through
17.
17.
Thank you. I think you made it to 16.
16. And he would not allow anyone to carry. Oh, wrong one. Sorry.
It's okay.
16. So they brought it, and he said to them, Whose image and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And Jesus answered and said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled.
Okay. So why did they think that this was such a good trap? What did they think that they were going to accomplish from this?
That Caesar was considered God in this culture, right? I believe, and so I think that, to me, that they're trying to get him to say that he's God or he's above Caesar. He's trying to make sure that they understand that all that is true.
So if he said not to pay?
Yeah, trying to get him to say that, yeah.
Right.
When they get on pay money, they could say he's inciting some sort of rebellion against taxes, against Caesar, then Rome would have to get involved.
It's blasphemous that way against Caesar.
And what would be the problem if he was like, came out as super pro-tax? Exactly. The Jews didn't like the Romans. So here they think they had this clever trap where, you know, either way he answers, they're going to have him somehow. But of course, he handles it in a very good way. This would have been the coin at the time. So during the time of Emperor Tiberius. So this is actually the Roman denarius that had Tiberius on it. And we know that in this area, they still had to pay taxes. Of course, they had, as Jews, they had different taxes like the temple tax, but of course, they're still paying taxes to the Romans as well.
The Herodians and the Pharisees were natural enemies as well. So we see their hatred, you know,
Right.
Just party up together and go after this guy.
Yeah, the Pharisees did not like Rome. The Herodians were loyal to Herod. And so, yeah, they normally would have not gotten along, but they had a common enemy, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I like how Jesus handles this situation. And I think one of the main points that he's getting to here, of course, he says his answer, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. And they marvel at his answer. But I think one of the main points that he's getting to is Jesus is not coming to set up a kingdom that's in opposition to Rome. This is kind of what Hunter was talking about. they would have loved for him to come out with some kind of answer about how, we're not giving anything to Rome, and in fact, I'm going to take over and we're going to destroy Rome. He's not setting up a kingdom that's in opposition to Rome. His followers, they can still follow and obey the civil law. They can still pay the tax while also being faithful to God. So, I had a question on here. Why do you think they marveled? Do you have a comment?
They tested him, and Christ said right then, show me, do you have a denarius? But showed he was broke. He was right.
Yeah, he didn't pull one out of his pocket. That's a good point. Never thought of that.
So bring me a denarius. I don't have any money. Well, we've got this coin here, supposedly. It came out of, it was a BC, it came out of, what's the cave up there? Where they had Isaiah, the book, and we bought the thing because of, what's your name? John Bassett. John Bassett, said he knew the guy, and he had an authenticity, and John said if he had the money, he'd buy it. Well, we had a card, so we bought it.
All right.
We still got it.
Yeah, I'd like to see it sometime. Very cool.
Yeah, actually, I do. I want to see that in the card.
Oh, very cool. Very cool.
So they marveled at, how quickly he was able to come up with the perfect answer. They expected him to be fumbling and trying to figure out, why they would have expected him. He wasn't ever fumbling before. But in their minds,
Right.
He's not going to be able to come up with a good answer.
And I'm also sure they've seen these Pharisees trap people before, and they would have been viewed as the authorities, and the fact that Jesus is able to handle them so easily, they continue to marvel at his teachings.
And Jacob, here's what I find hard for me as a Christian in 1 Peter 2:13 through 15. It says, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to kings as supreme, or to governors as to those who are sent by men for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. We have a difficult task, right? Half Christians are probably mad, last administration, other half mad, this administration, and guess what? We're supposed to sit back, be quiet, and serve God the way He said to serve Him, and know God is in control, and not let ourselves get off the rocker, not crazy. Stay off Facebook, quit doing crazy stuff, quit saying we need to put and stop the foolishness of men by the way that we act.
Right.
Well, going along with what Fritz said, it's not the main point of it. At 14, just sticks out to me is if we're going to emulate Christ, and they weren't meaning it really as they were complimenting Him, but that was not their full intent. That just saying that they know what they say about Him, that you're true, you don't care about anyone's opinion, you're not swayed by appearances, but you only teach the way of God. And just like Brett was saying, no matter what's going on around us, if we are true to God's word, not swayed by whatever's going on,
right,
whether they're saying it in a good way or a bad way, it should be obvious to those around us.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we'll end just because we have like 2 minutes left. Let's set up this story, and then we'll let Ryan handle it. This next story has to do with the Sadducees and the resurrection. So let's end by at least explaining as best we can what is the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Because these last couple stories have dealt with Pharisees, and he's got a different group. So verse 18, the Sadducees came to see him, who say that there is no resurrection, and they ask him a question. And so we'll get into that. I'll have Ryan get into that on Sunday. But other than the obvious, they don't believe in a resurrection. Do you guys remember any other differences between Pharisees and Sadducees? y'all know about the Sadducees?
John Sly has a good song about it.
Does he? we need
Picture and video.
to get him to come here and sing. The Sadducees, they're mostly from the priest class. They were around for a very short time, a much shorter time than the Pharisees were. They only show up in history for about 200 years, and since most of that is in the intertestamental period, we really don't know much about them. But different than the Pharisees, they were very wealthy, and they were from kind of the aristocratic side of the society, whereas the Pharisees, how do the Pharisees always try to present themselves? Like they're pious, right? They're not trying to come off as wealthy. So the Sadducees and the Pharisees quite different in a few ways. So as you prepare for Sunday, read the story about the resurrection. We'll let Ryan handle that when he's back. Thank you, guys. It's hard to follow that, man.
Well, in the Old Testament, we went to.
100%. Exactly, the truth. Great job, Nick. Great job. Thank you.
Continuous optimization engineer with Uber Express.
Yeah.
So they got me working nights.
Yeah.
I'm doing like a rollout for the software, I'm not happy about being that much.